Another EU summit is going on in Brussels today and tomorrow, where leaders will try to solve the Eurozone crisis. Now, they haven't been successful in doing so over the course of the last 18 summits. So what, you may ask, is different this time? Well, now leaders have this plan for a so-called genuine economic and monetary union. It's coming out of the president of the European Council's office, that's Mr. Herman Van Rompuy. It lays out building blocks for fiscal, economic, and banking integration. But who is Herman Van Rompuy exactly? Well, you're not the first person to ask.
The question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask, is who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you.
Nevertheless, Van Rompuy and his Eurocrat friends and some elected leaders are trying to hold the currency union together as support fractures around them. They're trying to hold it together despite protests, bailouts, the election of neo-Nazis, the deflationary spiral down of economies and trajectory up of bond yields in places like Spain and Italy. And Nigel Farage, who you just heard from, has been very frank about the possible consequences he fears. Take a listen.
This project could even cause the rebirth of National Socialism in Europe. We are heading...
Stark prediction, more on that later. First, does Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party, member of European Parliament, actually expect any earth-shattering decisions to be taken during this summit? Does he expect anything of substance to come from it that can change the current dynamics in Europe of rising borrowing costs for the periphery and the possible disintegration of the union? Well, let's see.
Let me tell you what will happen tonight. Tonight, later on, after the 27 leaders have had dinner with the bureaucratic bosses of the EU, there'll be a press conference. At that press conference, Mr. Barroso and Mr. Van Rompuy, the two unelected bosses of the European Union, will put on the table a paper that suggests that we move towards a common European treasury, a paper that suggests that the European Union becomes a debt union, and either Mr. Barroso or Mr. Van Rompuy, or both, in echo of each other, will say that it's an historic document, that it's been a wonderful meeting, that Europe has made a huge stride forward, and that the Eurozone crisis is near the end. That is what will happen. And you know what? Behind that, there'll be leaders of countries from Northern Europe who'll say, we don't subscribe to this, and there'll be leaders from Southern Europe who say, we can't accept the austerity package, and I believe there is absolutely nothing that will come out tonight from this summit that will move us forward by one single inch.
So more of the same that we've seen from any number of these summits where nothing has come of them. My question about that, is this a situation where, I don't know, perhaps the media circus and the financial market anxiety surrounding these Eurozone ministers and politicians is making it more difficult for them to deepen integration? Or, hey, have they not been adroit enough in actually exploiting a crisis that's tailor-made as an excuse for further union for those who want it?
Well, there is no doubt that since the birth of the European project over 50 years ago, they've always sought to use any crisis as an opportunity to deepen integration. And they're trying to do the same thing again, and that is what Mr. Van Rompuy's paper tonight proposes to do. But there is a problem. And the big problem is that the electorates of Europe have woken up to what the project's about. The Germans, the Finnish, the Dutch, they do not want this to become a debt union. They don't want to sign blank cheques in perpetuity to southern European states whose economies are not as competitive as theirs. And that is why you're seeing this resistance from Angela Merkel. I mean, she believes in this European project. She said 2 weeks ago, we should give allegiance to the European flag. Well, in my case, over my dead body. But that shows you that she believes in the European project, but for her, it has to be a German-style European project, or she will get thrown out by her voters next year. So, the decades when the bureaucrats and the leaders of countries could quietly meet and push forward a project of European integration are over because the electorates simply don't want it. And actually, what we've got here, I think, is an unbridgeable gulf between the culture of Northern Europe and the culture of Southern Europe. And what we do at these summits, and remember, this is summit number 19 since 2009, all we do is kick the can down the road. There's already talk of another summit in July. We reach no conclusions. The markets increasingly lose confidence, and who can blame them? And now we see Spanish 10-year debt, Italian 10-year debt hovering around this sort of critical 7% level.
That's right.
And the whole thing is headed for a gigantic bust.
Well, as you're on those yields, if there is one signal, one objective and clearly visible symptom of the problem with the Eurozone, it's in those rising spreads you're talking about between the surplus countries and the periphery. And the fact that countries as large as Italy, with public debt loads exceeding $2 trillion, are on the precipice of being priced out of the credit markets. And Spain with the 7% yield mark, again, that are considered unsustainable. Do you think the rising borrowing costs for Italy and Spain are of adequate concern to policymakers?
Well, remember, there are 17 countries that have mistakenly joined this Eurozone. So far, 5 of them have been bailed out. Nearly a third of them have needed bailing out. But the Spanish bailout was perhaps only a fraction of what is genuinely needed. If the Italian bailout comes, there is not enough money in Europe to bail out Italy, which has the 3rd highest level of debt in the world, exceeding 2 trillion, as you quite rightly put in your question. And I think that the markets are telling us that there is a total loss of confidence. The policymakers, the people really in charge of this, appear to be blinded to the whole thing. I mean, Mr. Barroso at G20 in Washington just last week appeared to be living on a different planet. You know, you can only go on kicking the can down the road for so long. I believe there is a very real and genuine risk that over the course of this summer, the markets will overwhelm the whole of the European system.
Wow, a prediction there. Let's talk about, though, the plan of those people on another planet that you're talking about, the plan you've referred to for the Eurozone, released by the European Council President's Office ahead of the summit from your friend, Mr. Herman Van Rompuy. Now, there were 4 building blocks laid out. Go ahead.
We're great mates. We really are great mates. Yeah.
So he laid out 4 building blocks for further integration. It includes proposals such as European bank deposit insurance and debt sharing. But interestingly, the one that really stuck out to us is this 4th building block, which is ensuring the necessary democratic legitimacy and accountability of decision-making within the EMU based on the joint exercise of sovereignty for common policies and solidarity. So what does this mean? Do you interpret this as an attempt at further political integration?
It's just communist speak, isn't it? You know, it's the old inversion of the language to mean the very opposite to what the truth is. You know, when Van Rompuy talks about political, democratic support for political union, it's laughable. He doesn't mean it. They treat democracy here with absolute contempt. The European Union as it is not undemocratic. It's actually fundamentally anti-democratic. And what they're trying to do tonight, what Van Rompuy and Barroso are trying to do tonight, is they're trying to get 27 member states to give up the ability through general elections and through having new presidents and new prime ministers from deciding their own budgetary rules. These are very, very bad, dangerous people. They're the worst people we've seen in Europe since 1945, and the fact they put in this document, under, as you quite rightly say, point 4, the sop to everybody, pretending that it needs democratic legitimacy, frankly, it is farcical.
Well, and to saying the opposite of what they mean, it's very 1984 to conjure another year or literary reference. But just on this note, to be clear, when in this document, Van Rompuy talks about the close involvement of the European Parliament and national parliaments that are essential to this democratic legitimacy, are essentially, is this document calling for kind of a broader EU electoral process, an EU-wide process where the European Parliament has more power over the national governments?
Well, they had the chance to do this. I mean, remember, these guys wrote a constitution for a political Europe 10 years ago. If ever there was a chance to democratise the European Union, that was it. And if they'd done it, and if they'd put it to the peoples of Europe in a free and fair referendum, I think people generally would have voted for it, believing that somehow now Europe had become progressive and forward-looking. They chose not to do so. And I repeat, the fourth part of this document that Mr. Van Rompuy is producing today isn't genuine, it isn't real. He is saying the very opposite of what he really intends and believes. There is not a single proposal to democratise this European Union, not a single proposal to include national parliaments anymore. They frankly are trying to hide behind this argument of democracy. They don't mean it.
Just to play devil's advocate, not to belabor the point, I don't know, do you think that all of this talk from Van Rompuy about democratic legitimacy could be because he has a chip on his shoulder or a complex that he is trying to get free from all the things you've said to him over the years, Mr. Farage, about how he wasn't elected and nobody knew who he was? I don't know. Could be.
Well, I must say I did laugh very loudly at the Washington G20 meeting when Barroso was up there, being interviewed by journalists like you, and he said, "We won't take lessons in democracy from you people," spoke the unelected leader of the European Commission. And you're right. You're right. I have been teasing them. I have been taking the mickey out of them for years. And actually, right across Europe, people agree with, they do agree with my point. An undemocratic Europe is frankly awful. It's a return to some of the things we saw in Europe pre-1945. They are sensitive to this point. They realise it's their Achilles heel, it's their vulnerability, and they're trying to deal with me in terms of rhetoric, but not in terms of substance.
There you go. Still had more of my interview with leader of the UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage. He'll continue to take the mickey out of Europe, in his words. We talked to him about what happens when core support for the euro breaks down when everyone's looking to that core to prop it up.